We're going to be in Hebrews chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High, met Abraham and blessed him as he returned from defeating the kings. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, his name means king of righteousness, then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace. Without father, mother, or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Now consider how great this man was. Even Abraham, the patriarch, gave a tenth of the plunder to him. The sons of Levi, who received the priestly office, have a command, according to the law, to collect a tenth from the people, that is, from their brothers and sisters, though they have all descended from Abraham. But one without this lineage collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed the one who had the promises. Without a doubt, the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, men who will die receive a tenth, but in another case, Scripture testifies that he lives. And in a sense, Levi himself, who receives a tenth, has paid a tenth through Abraham, for he was still within his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. This is the word of God.
How many of you remember the character called the most interesting man in the world? Anybody remember that guy? Yeah, some of y'all? Okay. All y'all people fast forwarded through beer commercials, I guess. He was featured in the Dos Equis beer commercials. I almost started by showing one of the commercials, but I figured maybe I shouldn't show a beer commercial. But it can't be much worse than The Office, and we've done that before. But anyway, so if you never saw the commercials, each commercial was just a narrator saying a bunch of absurd but supposedly true things about this fictional character called the most interesting man in the world. They were very similar to maybe some of the old Chuck Norris jokes, you had growing up. Kind of reminded me of that. So these are some of the things they would say. He once ran a marathon because it was on his way. And of course, they say this with this narrator, voice. That's a lot better than mine. Here's another one. If opportunity knocks and he's not home, opportunity waits. And the last one. Once a rattlesnake bit him. After 5 days of excruciating pain, the snake finally died. So each commercial would have a few of these quips, and then it would end by panning to the actual most interesting man himself, this actor, playing him. And he would look directly at the camera and he would say, I don't always drink beer, but when I do, I prefer Dos Equis. And the idea here, it's this mysterious, larger-than-life character. You don't know much about this guy, but he's like large and in charge, and you know it. And the idea here is that if this dude prefers Dos Equis, then you better also prefer Dos Equis, because you're not near as interesting and mysterious and as in charge as this guy. And so when I was reading through and even studying this character in the scriptures of Melchizedek, the most interesting man in the world is kind of where my brain went. I know y'all probably had more like spiritual things to think about, but that's what I thought of. Like, this Melchizedek guy is an extremely mysterious character. It's like he is so just in charge that he can just show up on the scene and leave. You get no background. He is one of the most mysterious characters in all of Scripture. And what this has done is it's left a lot of people up to their own imaginations to try to figure out who this guy really is. The reality is no one really knows. But regardless of who this person is, what is clear is that he was a powerful figure, and the preacher of Hebrews is going to use this mysterious character to further affirm the supremacy of Christ. If this mysterious character, Melchizedek, is greater than the respected patriarch Abraham, and if he is of a priestly order greater than the Levitical one that was revered and honored for centuries, then how much greater is Jesus, who is of the priesthood that Melchizedek could only shadow? So good morning again, church. Does something smell? Okay. Did somebody microwave a cup? Because those black cups make noise. Can you go okay. It was Andrew. All right, cool. Well, I'm assuming nothing's on fire. Is the microwave smell bad, or is it out here? Okay, so heads up, don't microwave those little black cups. They do something, and so I need to get a sign up. Yeah, multiple people have done it, just not on a Sunday morning, so. Andrew's 0 for 2 at distracting us, yeah. So yeah. Anyways, that's the smell. Everything's good. So at least we didn't cut the fire cables when we were replacing a light recently. So, all right. Yeah. All right. I was saying good morning. So I was like getting through that to get through my intro. I could smell it, but I was like, let me get through this. So, all right. Anyways, so good morning. My name's Joel. If you don't know me, I have the privilege of serving as one of the pastors here. So if I haven't got a chance to meet you, I'd love to do so. We'll just let that. All right. We've all acknowledged the burning. I'm going to keep smelling it. But was it a black cup? Is that what? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Don't microwave those. I told them. Those little cups, don't microwave them. So. If you need to heat something up, there is mugs in the shelf. They work better. So that's not Andrew's fault. I know. Well, now we're back to the garden. So blaming the spouse. So, I was trying to keep this sermon shorter. There's like 5 minutes of it. Literally this week, I'll take ownership. This week, my wife did that. And I said, I need to put a sign there that says, don't microwave the little black cups. But I didn't, so that's what happened. So. All right, we are in Hebrews chapter 7. So if you are not familiar, we typically preach expositionally through the text. And we are doing that this week through Hebrews chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. And so what that means, if you don't know, it just means we allow the text to kind of dictate what the meaning of the sermon is. And so that's what we're doing today. So Hebrews 7, 1 through 10. If you've been with us during our time in Hebrews, you will remember that our author, or preacher as we call him sometimes, he has been unfolding how Jesus is better than all these things that the listeners once held in high esteem or value. Jesus is better than the old priesthood order. He's better than the old covenant. He's better than the animal sacrifices. And what we're getting to is the point in his letter where really he's kind of been building to this. He's talked about how Jesus is better than angels, than Moses, but he's really been building to present to us Jesus as the high priest. And so he's hinted at it, but now from chapter 7 all the way into chapter 10, he's going to be unfolding what this looks like. But all of this starts with this mysterious figure named Melchizedek. In our text that you heard read a moment ago, you might have been a little confused. But our original listener knew that the listeners of the sermon, the original author knew that the listeners of this sermon or reading this letter would have known more about Melchizedek than we do. And so before we even really dive into Hebrews chapter 7, we need to kind of zoom back a little bit and see what story he's referencing. And the main thing about Melchizedek is Genesis chapter 14. So we'll have some verses on the screen. I'm going to give you a little bit of context. So few chapters earlier, there's a little bit of background for us. In Genesis chapter 12, in the midst of a very corrupt humanity, God calls a man named Abram, or sometimes referred to as Abraham later in his life. And he tells Abraham, hey, I'm going to bless you and you are going to be a father of many nations. Leave your land. And so he kind of does this and starts on this little journey. And then a couple chapters later, in chapter 14, is where we get this story about Abraham meeting Melchizedek. So there's a lot going on in the chapter. I'm going to do a little bit of summary for you. Basically, there are 9 different kingdoms that are at war. It's kind of like this localized world war. There's 5 kingdoms that ally to fight against 4 other kingdoms, all these weird names. You can go read it later. What happens is the 4 kings win the battle against the 5. And one of the 5 kings that was defeated was the kingdom of Sodom. Now what happens here in Genesis 13, Lot moved to Sodom. Lot is Abraham's nephew. So Abraham's kind of out of this scurry, but then Lot, because Sodom was captured, gets also captured. Lot, all his people that are with him and all his possessions. And so Abraham hears about this and he's like, all right, we're going on a rescue mission. Now we're told he has 318 trained men. So it's those 318 men against these 5 kings that have just won this battle against these 4 other kings, right? No, I think the 4 kings won the battle against the 5. But either way, he's going against these 4 empires. And somehow he defeats all of these 4 kings. We're not told how it happens. We're just told he wins the battle. And then the story picks up with Abraham back on his way from this battle in Genesis 14. I'm going to read for us from verse 17 through 20. The verses will be on the screen. It says, after Abraham returned from defeating Kedorlaomer, I practiced that like 40 times, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom, so one of the kings he actually just rescued, that wasn't his purpose was to rescue Lot, but Sodom was one of the ones that was rescued as well. He goes out to meet him in the Shaveh Valley. that is the king's valley. And here's where Melchizedek just shows up. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest to God Most High. He blessed him, so he's blessing Abraham, and he says, Abram is blessed by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has handed over your enemies to you. And Abram gave him, Melchizedek, a tenth of everything. So no warning or background. Melchizedek just gets dropped into this story. And it's very interesting because if you've read much of the Old Testament, the scriptures value genealogy and connection. They're big story points, but here we get nothing. He just swoops in. He gives Abraham bread and wine, which culturally this also probably meant an entire feast, and he blesses him. And then just as quickly, he vanishes away, and we literally never hear from him again in the biblical story. The only thing we get is a small quote from Psalm 110 that we'll see a little bit later. In Genesis 14, to look a little bit closer at this, we are told a few things about Melchizedek, the things that are important. First of all, we're told he was a king and a priest, which was very unusual. Now, this story is presented well before the temple system and the royal line of kings in Israel was ever even thought of, right? So that's in the future, but it's as if this idea of a priest and a king is introduced to us in the narrative to get us to start thinking that way. We're looking for someone to fulfill this role of priest and king together in one person. But if you keep reading the story, it never happens. And even the different priests and kings that were separate people in separate roles, they were really bad at it. The priests became corrupt, the kings became corrupt, but Melchizedek is presented as a faithful priest king of God Most High. So he is this great character, but he stoops down to bless Abraham. He brings out bread and wine and a feast, and he blesses Abraham. He invokes a blessing from the one true God Most High for the sake of Abraham. So he has some sense of knowledge about the one true God. The priest king Melchizedek is in need of nothing from Abraham. Rather, he is coming to give to Abraham. And then Abraham, not out of duty, but purely out of gratitude for this blessing and this feast, he gives a tithe or a tenth of the possessions to this mysterious king and priest Melchizedek. Culturally, this would have signified that Abraham was giving his allegiance and he was trusting this king. It's why he refuses to kind of do a deal with the king of Sodom, because he doesn't trust him. It wasn't that Melchizedek needed the tithe to survive. Melchizedek was self-sustaining. Clearly, he's this king priest who has all these possessions. And then that's it. On a cursory reading, Melchizedek is gone. The guy just comes and goes. Later in Psalm 110, we see this story, actually really just his name, invoked and quoted. Psalm 110 is a messianic psalm. Hebrews, the author, has already quoted it multiple times. It's where he says, "Today you are my son. The Lord said to my Lord." And it's this psalm about the one who rules and reigns. And in it, the Lord swears an oath that this person who's going to be the Messiah would be after the pattern of Melchizedek, the idea that he would be eternal. Okay, and so that's all we know about Melchizedek, but that's all the background we need to know to now go to Hebrews chapter 7 and see what our preacher is going to do with this person of Melchizedek. So let's step back into today's passage, Hebrews chapter 7. Let me read the first couple of verses again. It says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High, met Abraham and blessed him as he returned from defeating the king." So he's talking about the story from Genesis 14. "And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything." Okay. Now, before we even continue to zoom in a little bit deeper, one question always I feel like comes to mind when we're talking about Melchizedek, which is, who is this guy? Right? Like, we're like, who's Melchizedek? Some people down through the years have had their own ideas. Some think he was Shem, one of the three sons of Noah. If you do the math, he would have still been alive. He was a great, like something ancestor of Abram. He would have still been alive. He lived a long time. So that's one possibility. Other people see this as a clear pre-incarnate Christ coming and showing up to Abraham and blessing him as a priest king. That's also, I think, another valid view. And then another one is it simply is a historical figure. He's one of these kings that are ruling and reigning during this time, and he's a priest, and somehow he has knowledge of the one true God, and he's presented in the text the way he is because he is a foreshadowing or a type of Christ. Okay, so those are all, I think, a few valid options. The reality is none of us really know. The text tells us what's important, and that's it. I think his mystery is a part of the point. Because the focus, both in Genesis 14 and especially here in our Hebrews text, is not on who this person is and his identity, but rather on who he reminds us of and what he points us to. And that's what Hebrews chapter 7, verse 2 and 3 explicitly tell us. He begins unpacking this Melchizedek. He says, first, his name means king of righteousness. Then also king of Salem or Shalom. We might hear that interpretation, meaning king of peace, without father, mother, or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. And so it's very clear that when talking about Melchizedek, the author of Hebrews does not want us to get, to use a Kevin Perry word, wrapped around the axle. I've stole that from him because he says that all the time. He doesn't want us to get wrapped over the axle about who is Melchizedek. Rather, he doesn't want us to worry about figuring out that mystery, but to see through that lens of what it points us to. He first says that Melchizedek resembles the Son of God. Now, I think this is super important because I think it's easy for us to think like Melchizedek and the old system was plan A and then Jesus was plan B. No, he says Melchizedek resembles Jesus, right? So it's not as if Jesus is resembling Melchizedek. It's the other way around. Melchizedek is like Jesus. The plan has always been Jesus. He's the starting point. Jesus is the real thing. Melchizedek is only a shadow. So even in a passage, this is highlighting the superiority of Melchizedek over the Levitical earthly priesthood and over Abraham, but there is no mistaking that the ultimate point is that Jesus is better. The author also reminds us that the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness and also king of peace or shalom. Ancient tradition also says that the Salem that he was king over is none other than what eventually came to be called Jerusalem, Salem, right? This is the place where the tabernacle of God's presence dwelt. This is where true peace and righteousness could be found. And so these are all foreshadowing that. Not only was he the king of peace and righteousness, but he was eternal. The text does not tell us who his father or mother was, when he was born or when he died. Now, does this mean that Melchizedek literally never actually died or was born? Well, we don't know. Again, if he was a pre-incarnate Christ figure, maybe not. But if this is a real person, he did live and die. But the narrative, the text, does not present him that way, which again was very unusual for Genesis. And so in all of this, the preacher is getting ready to set up his argument that the earthly priesthood and the royal lineage of kings was never meant to be the final thing that brought humans back into God's presence. We need a better priest king. To make sure his hearers grasp this, he goes further to point out that Melchizedek is greater than both Abraham and the Levitical priestly line. Excuse me. So Abraham was a patriarch that was revered and honored. The Levitical priestly line was also revered and honored. But our preacher points out that Melchizedek is better. He does this through some logical arguments. We're not going to read through it again. Basically, he says, hey, Abraham actually tithed to Melchizedek, okay? And this came from the idea of tithe came to fruition when the nation of Israel was actually established. So this is years later. There were 12 tribes. One of them, the Levite tribe, received no land. And land in this culture was what allowed you to live and have sustainability and resources. So instead of them getting land, what they get is from each of the other tribes, they get 10%. And so they were selected to serve on behalf of the people, and it was this duty, it's a command, because the Levites needed to serve the people, and the people needed them to serve them as priests. That's where all the priests was chosen from. And so the people gave this tithe for them to live off of. But with Melchizedek, it's not a command. This is before any laws were established. He just freely gives a tithe, Abraham does. We're not told why it's 10%, but he gives that 10%. And the text says even more in a sense, Levi, who was technically in the loins of Abraham, I think is the literal translation there. And in a communal culture, this made sense. But basically, Levi, in a sense, through his family, is also tithing to Melchizedek. And so he's saying, hey, the one who is tithing, he is given to someone greater than who they are. That's his argument. And for this culture and those people, it made sense, okay? On top of that, Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And the author says, clearly the one blessing the other is the one of greater significance, okay? So Melchizedek is great. We see that in the text, but what does that do for us, okay? What are we to take away from this weird dude named Melchizedek and this tithe conversation? When you read this, there's a lot about tithe. Maybe our takeaway and our application today is you all need to give 10% to the church. That's a joke. I'll get there in a minute. Just last night, I read a headline that a mega church was being sued because they forced their staff to tithe 10%. I've seen other churches force staff to sign things that pledges to do the same, to give 10%. Yeah, wow's right. Even if we don't force others to sign commitments to give 10% of income, I have seen passages like this and others in the scriptures, like Genesis 14, used to say that this idea of a 10% tithe is binding on Christians today. And unfortunately, I think that's missing the point of passages like these, okay? We are called to contribute and hold everything we have with an open hand, but what that looks like, that's different from person to person. And as your heart, you're called to give cheerfully. We are not under the law, so a 10% tithe is not required for Christians. And if you really want to be under the rule, go talk to Joel Wallace. He'll tell you the percentage is closer to what? 20 something, it depends, 20, 30. Yeah, it's something crazy. So if you really want to do it, we'll go there and I'll take your money. But there's a lot of different tithes. I mean, it depends on the scholar you ask, but it's definitely more than 10%. And here's the thing, the ultimate point here, though tithing is something like we get in our culture kind of caught up on, the point here is not the tithe. The point is not even actually the identity of Melchizedek or even Abraham or Levi. The tithe used here is only a point to prove about the superiority of Christ over the earthly priesthood. Okay, and let me kind of flesh this out a little bit. How does the tithe point us to Jesus? The tithe under the old covenant. See, the reality is, if you think that all God requires of you to be right with him is to give 10% of your paycheck, you're not really listening to the words of Jesus. You're not really reading the scriptures. Jesus does not call us to give up 10%. He calls us to give up our whole lives. But even that is not because he's of the old priesthood order and he needs our 10% to survive or our whole life to survive. It is because we need it to survive. That's why he says, if you don't lose your life, you can't find it. The one who tries to gain the whole world will lose their soul. That's why he says, if you don't forsake all to follow me, you can't be my disciple. See, for humans to be in right standing with God, it's not a 10% tithe or a bunch of works or going to church every Sunday or whatever. For us to be in right standing with God, every ounce of our being must be fully surrendered to him at all times. We were each created to be that priest-king figure, to rule and reign with God as his image bearers in the world, and to take that as priests and spread that to the entire world. But we have all failed. We have all rejected that and gone our own way. There is none of us who have given 100% of who we are to God's kingdom. And so this passage is not ultimately about the need for a tithe. It is about the need for a high priest who has entered the most holy place to atone for the sins of humanity. The hearers of this sermon would have been intimately familiar with the way the sacrificial system and the economy worked. They understood tithing as both a religious and economical requirement. They saw it as this exchange. In order for earthly priests to bless the people and intercede for them on behalf of God, they had to then support and tithe to them. It was this give and take. You give me the tithe, I'll give you the blessing. I'll go make the sacrifices on your behalf. The blessings were a response to the commitment of tithe. But under the order of Melchizedek, Abraham gives tithes not because Melchizedek is in need, not to earn some blessing as this transaction, but because he had already been freely blessed. Melchizedek comes out of nowhere and just lays out the table with bread and wine and gives a blessing. He doesn't demand anything from Abraham. Under the eternal priesthood, the order is swapped. This is how it is under the new covenant. There is nothing that we could ever do, no amount of money that we could ever give, no amount of good works we could do, no amount of sacrifices we could offer that could manipulate God to bless us. All of our righteous works are filthy rags in the sight of God. We need a priest, king, mediator. And that's what Melchizedek points us to. The biblical narrative is always looking for this priest-king figure, a king who has the authority and resources, but also one who will crawl down and intercede for the people as a priest. And this is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus, the Son of God, according to the order of Melchizedek. He was the Word at creation, always existing, uncreated and eternal. Yet this Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He was the king who lived as a peasant. So he is not like a high priest who doesn't understand our weakness. He is a king who spoke with authority. You know what he quotes when he's talking to the religious leaders? He quotes Psalm 110, claiming to be the Son of God, this messianic fulfillment. And when he went around, he lived like a priest. He healed people of their diseases so they could be in the presence of God in the temple. He was restoring them to right relationship with each other because diseases kept them on the fringes. But even more than that, the Son of God had authority to forgive people of their ultimate disease, their sin. And he's dealing with that. And with his death, he gives us the greatest gift ever. Not because we gave him 10%, and it was his duty to bless us. It was this transaction. No, rather, it was because he wanted to bring us back into the family of God for his own glory and of his own free will. Like Melchizedek, in the upper room, he lays out a feast of bread and wine. But the bread and wine that he offers us is his body and blood. And he says, come, feast, and you'll never hunger again. You who are thirsty, come and drink without price. There is no earning of this. It is a free gift. And all the curses of the sin that we deserve because we broke the covenant terms, they were all placed on his back. And he upholds the end of the covenant by willingly dying. He is the sacrifice. It's a theme all the way back in Genesis 15 to Abraham and Isaac. He is the one who crawls up on the cross, not out of obligation, not out of duty, not out of command, but out of love, out of delight. For the joy set before him, he endured. And then with authority as a king and with empathy like a priest, he hangs on the cross and he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And he trusts his life to his Father. He breathes his last breath. He's laid in a cold, dark tomb. But in verse 8 of our text today, we're told that in the one case, men who will die receive a tenth, but in the other case, scripture testifies that he lives. This is not an earthly priest who dies and then needs another descendant to come and take his office. Jesus is the risen, final king of righteousness and peace. He is the final risen priest who today intercedes at the right hand of the Father on your behalf. And through his life, death, burial, and resurrection, he gives us his very best. God has not withheld any good thing from you. And the proof of that is that he gave us his only son right up front. We might not always see the good that he has in our lives, but we can trust him. He prepares for us a feast of blessing based on his work, not ours. He says, come through me. You don't have to earn it to sit at his table. And even more mysterious than Melchizedek is the mystery of the gospel, as Paul calls it in Ephesians. The mystery that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners. You could never give enough to buy this. You can never do anything to earn it. It's good news. That's why it's called good. It's the gospel. It's based on free grace alone. And Jesus frees us from the curse of the law. He fulfills the covenant. We are now no longer under the obligations of the old system. We are free indeed. All of the old covenant, the tithe included, it was just a shadow of heavenly realities. Again, not even just pointing forward to, but pointing back to what's always existed in the heavenly realm. And when we begin to grasp this, when we, like Abraham, who after defeating all these enemy kings, Melchizedek comes in and makes sure he knows that is because God Most High gave you the victory. We don't beat our sin in our own self or our own flesh or by our own merit. The enemy of sin was defeated by Christ. And when we recognize that God has worked in our life, this begins to transform us. Not based on duty, not based on command, but we say, here's my life. It is all yours. Because I've seen what happens when I try to take control. We surrender everything, not just 10%. That's weak. We give our resources, gifts, money, whatever it is. And this is out of trust and gratitude. When we realize that God did not withhold his only son from us, but gave him to us to redeem us, this releases our grip on things of this age. Now, this doesn't mean you literally give everything away. But it could mean that you give more away than you think you're supposed to. And it does mean this. Let me explain this. This means that everything we have is to be used for the kingdom. And that can look a million different ways. We need to get a little more creative than just writing a check to the church, okay? Here's an example I use. Like the things we're given, okay, I believe we're called to do two things with them. Glorify God by both enjoying them and sharing them. So sometimes you need to just enjoy it. Like enjoy a good vacation or something. Like if you have the means to do that, that's awesome. Enjoy it. Teach your kids to enjoy good gifts, but not to hang on to it so tightly that we're never willing to share it. An example might be if you have a place of your own to live in. That home is God's, not a 10% corner over here. Like let's make our little shrine to God over here. We're gonna give him this 10%. No, like the whole thing. It's all God's. So what I say, fix it up, paint it, renovate it, make it beautiful. Make it a home where there's rest and there's laughter and there's joy and your kids experience this place of shalom, this place of peace that's beautiful, or you and your roommate, your family, whatever your situation is. But it's also held with an open hand. You got that new paint job and you host community group and some kid comes dragging a pin down the wall. I'm not slapping their hand out. Now I might tell them stop, that's why I tell my kids, hey, take care of stuff, steward it. But if the walls get marked up, it's okay. It's all right. And that goes for anything we've been given. Our cars, our money, our careers, our gifts. These are all good gifts that God's giving you to freely enjoy and then also to share. Not out of compulsion or duty, but out of love and delight. Again, it'll look different for everyone. That's why we need community. That's why we need the Spirit. We have needs as a church. We invite you to partake in what God's doing, right? I mean, there's principles about caring for pastors and taking care of things. That's awesome. Like we could talk about those when we get to those expositionally. The point is, that needs to be freely. It's very clear, Paul says, out of cheerful, not out of compulsion. And I mean that so much that I say, if it's out of compulsion, stop until that heart is figured out. Like I mean that. Go do some work with God. Let's figure that out, right? Gonna look different for everybody. Putting a number on it and making a new law is easy. That's where that 10% comes from. God's not after your money. He's after your heart. I believe that's why we're not given hard and fast guidelines. We can't reduce union with Christ to a 10% tithe. And again, if that's where you want to start, that's awesome. There is nothing wrong with that. I'm not demeaning that. But Jesus is way bigger than any of this is what I'm getting at, okay? And at the end of the day, it's all of grace. We can only freely give when we realize what we've been freely given. And for some people, that might be 0.5%. Like, it's okay. At the end of the day, it's all of grace. Philippians tells us God will provide every need for us in accordance with the riches of Jesus. We believe that. There is a wealth of treasure at his feet. There is a feast awaiting us. So before you ever start thinking, what can I do for God? What can I give to him? First, I implore you to fully receive the feast that's offered you in the gospel. Know Christ and him crucified. Know the free gift of grace offered you in the gospel. And when we begin to grasp that, then the fruit of the Spirit will produce in you a spirit of gratitude and selflessness. So go and be free in Christ. Live in light of that truth. Jesus is a high priest of the order of Melchizedek, and his life is given freely to you at no cost and for no price. He is so much better than a tithe.